Catherine. So it's Emily. I'm just going to be doing a very quick presentation about virtual professional boundaries and the importance of them. So just to talk about the mission of FASS and setting professional boundaries, and why the skill is so important, especially right now, uh, as we are an online organization. This presentation discusses the importance of setting boundaries in this context. So practitioner-client relationships have failed to keep up with the advances of technology. As boundaries in a social work context are traditionally linked to a relationship that gives power to the practitioner, which in the case of FASS is something that we're trying to work against as we're trying to empower our clients. So setting these boundaries in a professional context should be normalized as it is a way of protecting individuals' mental health and honoring individuals' boundaries, along with it helps with it helps with setting boundaries between client and practitioner as well. So professional solicitation in this context can also create some unclear boundaries, as the members of the community that we are serving are generally English second language, or they just speak Cantonese. So it can create some miscommunications between the practitioner and client, and even between members of our staff. Oops. So just to talk about a little bit about myself, like professional and personal boundaries are something I've always struggled with. In the past, I've always had a difficult time setting these boundaries and then maintaining them, as I am a very I can be a bit of a pushover as a person, and so learning how to set these boundaries in a professional context is something I've been struggling with, but the boundaries that I have set have created huge differences in my professional life and in my personal life. So my experience at FASS is letting me learn how to set these professional boundaries on an online context, being an example of this being me explaining to my group that I'm only able to be reached from this one time to another time, and then only during certain days, like Monday to Friday, on certain platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook, hypothetically. So I have noticed that setting these boundaries have made me better at communicating. I do feel less overwhelmed and anxious. I have met my personal needs first, and I also just have less tolerance for toxic behaviors that others might have, in that being clients or other staff. So just to talk about boundaries, first, defining physical, emotional, mental boundaries is an essential part of establishing a healthy mental state, personal limitations, character, self-respect, and self-worth. And that's not saying if you don't set boundaries, you don't have that, but it helps in enhancing all of these characteristics. So boundaries are limits that are set either by an individual or a collective that define what one is comfortable with in that setting, and they are not for negotiation. Boundaries should be changed, and boundaries are flexible and can be changed depending on the context and depending on the situation. And one boundary is not, having one boundary for one specific situation doesn't have to carry over to every single situation as well. So just to talk more about the professional boundaries in a social work context, the Canadian Association of Social Workers has a code of ethics that outlines ethical issues with crossing boundaries. The code of ethics speaks to what boundaries are appropriate, how to set boundaries, and just kind of more of a traditional ethics stance on this. However, a core social work skill is the ability to relate to others and their problems. So the individual in the professional role should limit the personal disclosure, expectations, extent, duration, and focus of the relationships with clients. However, these boundaries can be difficult to define with coworkers, as contemporary therapeutic practices try to build close relationships as a way to deconstruct power relations through amplifying marginalized voices, which I'll talk a bit more about later. It can be detrimental as it does set unclear boundaries between the client and practitioner. So what I'm ultimately getting to here is that the relationship between client and practitioner should always be extremely professional, And then between staff members, there is a bit, it can be a little harder to set personal boundaries as, um, yeah, it just can be harder to set personal boundaries. So setting appropriate boundaries is difficult sometimes because there are some cultural differences between different communities. So what might be ethical in one situation or okay in one situation might not be okay in another context. So it's necessary to determine what the boundary is in each situation. The boundaries should in the boundaries should take into account gender, class, sexuality, and culture, um, and they should be used to surround and connect each other instead of divide. So it should ultimately, if you're setting boundaries in the correct way, it should allow you to work better with others as everyone is in a space where they feel happy and respected. So maintaining appropriate boundaries is also important, as creating a positive relationship-based approach is essential. And the maintenance of these boundaries needs to include the collective. So everyone should be aware of one person's boundaries. Everyone should be aware of others' boundaries. So that way, if there are changes in the relationship, knowing others' boundaries makes it easier to accommodate for changes in the relationship. So it's proven that better long-term relationships occur when boundaries are set successfully. So lastly, just to talk a bit about mental health and self-care, burnout is super common with social workers, especially social workers at a frontline level, like what we're doing at FASS, dealing with clients at a very frontline level. So setting boundaries is one of the ways to prevent this in the long run. Mental health is very important right now, especially during the shift to technology, as people are more isolated, people are relying on technology more. And it's causing a lot of mental health issues. So setting these professional boundaries in an online setting is necessary in order to separate one's personal and professional lives. So just to talk briefly about some of the skills associated with professional boundaries, I think the greatest skill would be to first understand the code, the CASW Code of Ethics, as it does outline a very professional, traditional stance to ethic issues for social workers. And I think having a very having a good understanding of that allows you to make decisions based off of that basic understanding. However, that shouldn't be the key thing that comes into consideration when creating a boundary. Emphasizing connecting over separation, as in trying to create boundaries that are used to connect people over like create a divide, that should be a priority as well. As personal relationships, as creating deep relationships with a client and with others is very important in a social work context as well. So to know whether you're doing this right and whether you're doing it ethically, you must practice critical self-reflection during the entire process, consistently asking yourself questions like, what do I need? How do I hold power in this context? And then also just asking others for their opinion as well. Sometimes what might seem like an ethical boundary might not be appropriate in a given situation. So asking others, asking your supervisor, but ultimately asking yourself about what you think is truly right in the situation where the client's needs and the organization's needs are both being met. So lastly, working with narrative approaches and learning from the clients and the other, essentially, and learning about their experiences, their culture, their identities, to better understand the context that the situation is in. So, for instance, learning from a client that they're an immigrant, that they are their parents both don't speak English, they're providing for their family. You can better understand what might be right and what might not be right in that situation, and you're able to set boundaries based off of that. And you're able to set more clear boundaries based off of that for you and for the client. So yeah, these are just some resources regarding boundaries. The first one is just a professional guide to uh, setting and maintaining these professional boundaries. The second is, of course, the Code of Ethics. And the last one is just talking more about boundaries in social work. And this one I found really interesting because it talked about the history of setting boundaries in social work and how it's progressed to where we are now. So yeah, these are just some questions to think about. Again, just something to leave you with. I think that they're all really interesting, and these are things that I've really thought about myself when I was creating this presentation, and I found it made me realize a lot about myself and about how I set these boundaries. So yeah, lastly, these are my references, and yeah, thank you.